Hey man, do you ever notice how it seems like a lot of your current work is way worse than some of your old work? I don't know if I like where this is going or not, but I'm kind of in the middle of a commission right now, so if we could talk about this later. Look, all I'm saying is as a human, we're technically supposed to be creatures of, habit. And the way I see it, you use it or you lose it. And you've been doing a lot of commissions recently where people have been paying you to do relatively simple paint jobs that, let's face it, the quality isn't the highest, but that's what they pay for. And that's resulted in your own work being what the? Or, before you get mad, maybe I'm just the personification of the occasional rude YouTube comment you get, and the thought of imposter syndrome is slowly driving you mad. What? Wait, I... Welcome back to Tabletop Glory. My name is Graham Johnson, and today I'm just going to head some things off at the pass. I have done a lot of commission work, especially back when the game store was open. It made it easy for people to find me, and I've done commissions of all shapes and sizes. I've done retouching of anime figures to make them more screen accurate. I've painted large-scale figurines and limited edition collectibles. I've done a lot of busts. I've done a lot of Warhammer. I've done a ton of Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder and all of that good fun stuff. And I've done a real mix of other things as well. And what that's resulted in is me having multiple paint styles that I can easily paint in. The two biggest being my own style, or at least what I'd like to think is my own style, as well as heavy metal, which is Games Workshop's painting style. Those tended to be the two things that I got commissioned to paint the most of. And recently, I've kind of only really been commissioned to do a lot of heavy metal and very simplistic paint schemes because, everybody's budget is different, and that's just what some people can afford, and that's absolutely fine. But what that has resulted in is the discovery that painting styles are like speaking multiple languages. The more that you speak those languages, the more fluent you become in them, and the less you speak in them, the more you start to lose them. And my current painting style, I've really started to lose. If you take a look at some of my more recent work compared to some of my older work, you can definitely tell that there's a bit of a lapse there, or that I'm leaning a little bit more heavily on the heavy metal crutch. And I want to start to move away from that. Recently, I've been watching a lot more of NinJon's videos, and I've really been enjoying the way that his style has been evolving because it's heavily reminiscent, at least of the final product, in what mine used to look like. And I really want to get back there. Although that having been said, NinJon does a way better job at pushing the contrast and the blends than I was ever at. He is quite a bit farther along in his journey of miniature painting than I am, but he's right where I want to be. And today's video, I'm not going to copy him, but I am going to take a page out of his book, and I'm going to try to speak his language a little bit today and try out a few techniques that he's done in some of his recent videos and see if I can't start to get myself back to where I used to be. So recently, NinJon put out a video where he was kind of going back in and taking a closer look at his version of Slapchop and how he could evolve it. And I really liked the final result. It really set you up well for kind of blocking the shadows in a bit more directly and really making those highlights pop, and it made me realize that maybe this form of Slapchop is something that I'm really going to enjoy. So I decided we're going to go ahead and give it a try. Now in his video, he starts out by doing a black base and then hitting it with a purple in the shadows, and he goes a lot more vibrant with his purple than I do. And perhaps for more of an action-y type figure, I'll do the same. But since we're dealing with a civilian here, I don't think that the shadows need to be too over the top. And I also don't think the highlights need to be all that over the top, which is why you'll see toward the end of the priming process that I don't actually end up pushing those highlights quite as far as NinJon does in his video. Now, I went ahead and did the same thing that NinJon did in his video, where he went ahead and started to kind of put in a seraphim or a sepia type of tone into the highlights before he actually painted his highlights. And looking at the final primed result, I think that this step may not necessarily work, and I'll probably be skipping it going forward. It probably helps NinJon to visualize a bit better as to where his next stage of highlights is going to end up. But for me and my color blindness, this blended in so well with the black that it just seemed a bit pointless for me. Now, rather than using a seraphim sepia type of tone or going out and buying a sepia type wash, I actually just mixed a yellow and orange contrast paint and kind of ended up in the same ballpark as seraphim sepia anyway, and so that worked really well for me. If you're following along at home and want to try something similar, but you don't want to also go out and buy tons of inks, using contrast paints can be a really great way of getting similar tones. Just go ahead and water them down with something like a Lamian medium or something like that so that they still act like a paint. If you put too much water in your airbrush, it can thin things out to the point where it doesn't quite stick to the model properly. And that's just my one piece of advice I'd give for those of you who are following along at home. Anyway, moving right along, I noticed that I was having to use a lot more white ink than I thought I was going to have to. And I don't know if that's because of my brand Liquitex ink that I'm using is necessarily thinned out, or perhaps I didn't shake it enough. I don't know. There could be a lot of factors here. But I went ahead and with very minimal pressure coming out of the airbrush, I went in and very lightly kind of just hit all of what I thought were the important areas on this miniature. This guy, I'm sure, is meant to be some kind of beggar, but in my mind, he could also be used as like a farmer who is a quest giver. Maybe he was attacked by some kind of animal in the night a few weeks before the adventuring party shows up, and he is a figure that you want your party to talk to kind of set the next quest off. So I wanted to go ahead and highlight his crutches, his missing leg, and I wanted to highlight the fact that he's got an eye patch, and I wanted to make sure that your eye was drawn to all of those things. So I went ahead and hit them with just a little bit extra white so that it kind of pops a little bit more in the next few steps. Now in NinJon's video, I believe he adds just a little bit of yellow into his sepia ink. I just decided to use a bit more of my yellow contrast in my mix and just go a little bit heavier. Looking back on this may have been a little bit of a mistake, but I feel like my biggest mistake is I add a little too much white and a little too much yellow to my final highlight. Although that having been said, looking at the model, the way that it looks now that everything is dry and ready for paint, who knows? We're gonna find out when we go to put contrast on it. I'm kind of recording my reaction to every stage as we go along, as I would like my thoughts and opinions to not be swayed by the final result. So I decided I wanted this initial pass of colors to just kind of be a way of blocking things in. We're just going to be using contrast paints, or in the one case of the brown tunic, I went ahead and heavily mixed that with some contrast medium to get a similar effect. And I'm not super happy with that, but we'll talk to it when we get to it. I wanted to stick more with earth tones, so we're using some nice dark greens for all of the fabric that I want to be the undershirt, and then we're sticking with warm browns just because I feel that weathering that up makes it look more loved and worn and less worn out, if that makes sense. Initially, I was just going to use Skeletal Horde for any kind of straps for kind of bandage type materials, as well as for the crutches themselves. However, I wasn't happy with how dark they were. I wanted them to be a little darker. So I went ahead and hit that with some Go Gunther Fur. Typically, that's what I end up using to do most of my base tones for wood anyway. So we're kind of hitting those familiar marks anyhow. Going real light with the skeletal horde, as I can always deepen and darken things a little later on. I wanted to follow the idea of less is more, and honestly, now that I've seen it all dry, I may not even go back in and touch it up outside of some highlights, so I'd call that good enough. Now, I initially hit all of the flesh with Gilliman's flesh from Contrast. However, I'm not super happy with how dark that turned out on top of our base tone. Normally, when I just do a black and white gradient for my priming, doing Gilliman's flesh kind of just works. This really didn't work. I think if I had gone in and done my normal Bugman's through Kislov and then used it more as a glaze on top of everything, it would have worked just fine. I think it's not going to be super hard to fix this though, so we'll do that with some of the layering here in a bit. Now, I initially thought that chocolate brown from Vallejo would be dark enough for the tunic, but I wanted some of that pre-shading that we did already to show through, so I mixed in a little bit of our medium into that, and it almost came out the exact same color as the leather. And I think it'll work all right. I'm planning to go back in and glaze in a much darker brown, probably a German black brown, into a lot of those recesses and kind of blend forward to back on the miniature a bit better. The back is actually almost as dark as I want the front to be, so it shouldn't be that difficult to kind of blend this all out. I think it's important to manage expectations when it comes to mimicking something that you've seen another YouTuber do. It's important to keep in mind, especially in my case, who is not really loving the process right now, but is trusting the process, that NinJon didn't just wake up one day and decide to start painting like this. This is a technique that he has evolved and gotten it to a point where it works for him. And I'm just doing my best to kind of mimic what I've seen him do on videos, and this is literally me just rolling out of bed one day, watching the video, going, that looks cool, that looks like what I used to do. I can't really get that muscle memory back, so let's redevelop that muscle memory and use him as a starting point. And literally, I rolled out of bed, watched the video, and then tried it. So I have to keep in mind that my final result may not look as good as his final result, and that's okay. And that's something that I think that we as miniature painters need to keep in mind as well. All of that said, what have I learned so far? Well, I have learned that my yellow, when it blends with any of the magenta purple color that I sprayed on into my shadows, immediately turned green, which has resulted in green being a mother color, which is one of the reasons I have chosen to try to do a lot of earth tones to kind of help blend everything and make that paint scheme cohesive. However, that's created a lot of challenges that I wasn't initially anticipating. A lot of that being that some of these contrast paints that I'm very familiar with not acting how I'm used to them acting, as well as them coming out in a completely different tone once they're dry from how they looked when they were wet. Now, yeah, paint darkens as it dries, and there are some brands out there that brighten as they dry, and knowing how that works can help us a lot as miniature painters, but this is one of the first times I've experienced the color shifting slightly to a slightly different tone from where it began. I think one of the best examples of this color shifting is it wasn't looking half bad when I was initially putting the Gillimans onto the face. However, as it started to dry, I realized it would make a great starting point for an African American skin tone, but also it'd make a great standpoint when put throughout all the hair to do a dirty blonde kind of effect. So I decided that I wanted to try and maintain this Caucasian skin tone because there were places on the body where I had painted this where it definitely still fell within that realm of Caucasian. And I'm not really that great at painting African American skin tones, and although now probably would have been a good time to experiment around with and try to develop that a bit more, I decided that I was already doing enough experimenting today and I wanted to do some things that were more familiar to me. So we're just going to try to knock things back into that Caucasian skin tone range. Now, all of this said though, notice how I'm not like starting the model over. I'm not hating it. I'm not, holding my own lack of experience against me. When I used to run the game store, a lot of people who would come and bring their miniatures to me and ask what they did wrong, or would bring miniatures asking for some level of advice, would oftentimes tell me that this was the third or fourth time that they had painted the model and that they had hit their first roadblock and gotten really frustrated and just stripped the model down and started completely over again. And one of the biggest pieces of advice I can ever give is anytime you think you're making a mistake, try to work through it. You will teach yourself so much more by seeing an experiment through to the end than by thinking you've made a mistake, starting over, and then just never getting the model finished. You will grow so much faster as a miniature painter if you learn to do that. And I even think that a few miniature painters who I follow, at least within the last 2 or 3 weeks, have all said something very similar in their videos about how some of the best painting they have ever done is when they thought they had made a mistake and decided to see it through and do an experiment, and they got a result that they were exceedingly happy with. Now, I think because of the way that I set things up in motion to begin with, by not going super bright and vibrant with my primer, I am going to have to lean a little bit heavier on a desaturated highlight. So we're going to go ahead and mix Warpstone and Moot Green to make our highlights for the shirt under the tunic. I'm really not wanting to push highlights to an extreme with this kind of paint job. I think if I really wanted to spend my time and put a lot of nice thin layers, I could build up some crazy vibrancy in these highlights and really pushing the contrast between the shadows and those highlights. But for a miniature like this, I don't think that's really necessary. Now, like I said earlier, I wanted that tunic or this vest to kind of be a nice dark brown, so that's exactly what we're going to be using. Vallejo's exact name for it, I believe, is German Sea Black Brown. When you thin it out quite thin, it does come out a little bit deeper than some of the GW browns will go. So if you're limited with what you have, you may want to add a little bit of black to your brown. And unlike how I would build up the highlights, I actually was quite happy with where the highlights were on this. So I'm actually glazing this color into the shadows and then feathering it out into the existing color. And that kind of got this coat to where I wanted it, and I'm really happy with how it ultimately turned out. And it allowed the belts and buckles that are all over his shirt to kind of pop and be on their own and look distinctly different, which was something I was worried about initially. I thought they kind of blended in with that tunic. Next off, Zandri Dust. I'm just going to hit all of the stuff that looks like it could be made out of linen, and I'm also going to very lightly glaze this onto all of the belts, and this really helps everything to pop. I then used a mixture of that German black brown and a mixture of some other similar Zandri Dust Ushabti Bone type colors, and I mixed up 3 different tones. I started with the hat, but ultimately I ended up applying slightly different tones to all of the different items that are leather other than the tunic, as a way of helping these things to kind of pop and stand out and be different from the stuff that is around them. Ultimately, there's not really a whole lot of a guide I could give you. This is kind of just what looks good to your eye versus what looks like it's blending in a little too much. Now I ended up doing a little bit of a mild glaze of the skin tone, which I'm using Kislev Flesh over the hair just a little bit. This is going to kind of brighten things up. And then I took a little bit of Averland Sunset to give him a blonde appearance. Now with the skin tone, this took 4 coats of Kislev Flesh. And that's just because Kislev is a very transparent color. And it works really nice if you layer it on top of reds, whereas in this case, in some parts of the model, I'm almost layering up from a black. So it took quite a few coats, which I don't show all on camera, but just know that the skin tone is Kislev Flesh. And unlike normally, where I would put another wash of either some kind of a flesh wash over top or some more Gilliman's diluted over top, I actually liked how much of the Gilliman's was still showing through and decided that good enough was good enough. Now I almost forgot these little stitches on the front and back of his shirt. Initially I hit these with Ushapti Bone, but it wasn't quite right for me. It didn't look bright enough, and I mixed a little Kislev Flesh in out of desperation, and that kind of did it for me. I'm not really sure why this mixture made it look a little bit brighter. Maybe it's not even brighter. Maybe it's just the slight tonation difference, but it popped a little bit more, and I liked the final result, so we're going with it. I just did a little touch of Blood for the Blood God on the bottom of his stump, so that way I can either use him as a random beggar or a recent victim of a major accident and use him as a quest giver for a D&D campaign. Regardless, I wanted him to have somewhat multifunctional, so I decided to go with this and not just go way over the top with the gore. And here we have it. Perhaps a little bit darker than you guys might be used to seeing from me, but ultimately I do really like the final result. Now, does that mean that my feud with Slapchop is over? Maybe. Does this mean that I am 100% happy to the point where I would replicate this over and over again? No. However, I am happy with it enough that I am willing to come back to this a few more times and try to dial it in myself to get that right balance of highlight to contrast, or highlight to shadow, I should say. And I'm kind of excited for this, actually. Maybe this will get me over my love-hate relationship with Slapchop, who knows? In any case, I tried something new today with how I'm showing off the miniature here at the end of the video. Hopefully you guys like this. It's a little bit more lighting than what I used normally, which is why I've included some photos with some different lighting, so you guys can get a better understanding of what the miniature really looks like when it's in your hands. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed today's video, and as always, may your display case always be filled, and your pile of shame never runs empty. Until next time.